All right, so Zachary asks, how aggressive of a deficit should you go for on a mini cut?
Um, well, that will depend on body fat percentage, obviously, greatly. And I actually think that Martin McDonald's equation, which is I think your body fat percentage divided by 15, 15 to 13. So I heard him saying 15 and 13 at other times. So let's say your body fat percentage is 15%, then you would, if you divide that by 15, then that's one. And that would be 1% weight loss per week. Like on average, that's what you're shooting for. If you divide it by 13, then it would be a bit higher. Then I don't know, it would be 1.2 or something. And if you're 30% body fat, so you have quite a bit to lose as a man, then it would be, like 2%. If like 30 divided by 15 is 2. So 2% weight loss per week, that's a very aggressive diet if you maintain that throughout, even like a 4 week long mini cut, even a 3 week long mini cut, like you're gonna lose a lot.
Sure.
But so like I actually think that that's a pretty good kind of just rule of thumb. And obviously you have to know your body fat percentage for that, like at least like remotely accurately. But I would say it mainly comes down to that. And as far as like what calorie deficit that would contribute to, like generally speaking, like 1% weight loss per week is around the 30% deficit, give or take. 0.7 ish percent weight loss per week is roughly 20%. And then, yeah, like 10% deficit is where you get to that like 0.5% loss per week. So just if you're wondering, and I think like 40% deficit would be actually not even sure what that is. I think 1.5, but I could be wrong about that. So yeah, like you can push it quite a bit, but just cannot be crazy if your body fat percentage is just really not conducive for an ultra aggressive weight loss.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of mini cuts. I know they were super popular for a while and now they're still talked about, but not as much. I think they're fine. I think if you mentally need a break from eating so much or you just feel like you're getting a little too soft, I don't think it really changes where you're going to end up at the end of a bulk. Like if you did, you're like, hey, I'm going to spend the next year gaining. If you threw in two mini cuts in that time, like I think it's fine. I think if you end up still being at, let's say you start at 180 and you're like, I want to get to 200 after a year, and you do that, I think you probably could have either just gone there a little slower or like you could just go a little more aggressive and then say, hey, I'm going to cut back and do this little mini cut. Obviously, if you're extending the amount of time, then sure, mini cut. Like if you were to say, hey, I'm going to have 12 months of a surplus or 12 months of a surplus, and in there, there's going to be 3 months of a deficit. Well, now you're talking about 15 months of time. So then, yeah, the end result could be greater because you just had more time lifting in this example, and you had time to kind of like lose some fat and go back up. But if we're talking about the same time frame, I would just say, hey, go with a slightly less aggressive surplus so that you don't need a mini cut. But again, I'm not that partial one way or the other. Somebody said I want to do mini cuts. I think that's fine. Excuse me. I think that's fine, but it's not something that I think is really crucial. If somebody wants to do it, then as Abel said, it would definitely depend on body fat percentage. You can be much more aggressive when you are at a higher body fat percentage. But if you're not at a high percentage, I would ask why you're doing a mini cut in the first place. If you got down to 8% body fat and now you're slowly going up to, and now you're 12% body fat and you ask me to mini cut, I'm going to really need a good answer as to why you actually need a good mini cut or why you actually need a mini cut for us to do it. I would say it's maybe when you're getting uncomfortable with how you're looking. And then at that point, I would probably say if we're really getting to that point of being uncomfortable, like we're now like 18, 20% body fat, then I might just say it's time for a real cut. So I think a lot of times the reason for a mini cut is just like, you're just kind of mentally tired of it. Same reason that I would put like a deload, for example, with somebody's training. I would almost call it like a deload from bulking just so that you can kind of reset there. In which case, yeah, I would say you can probably go into a 500, even 1,000 calorie deficit. That's no problem. You could even do more if you really wanted to, if you kind of wanted to do a little bit of a rapid fat loss. I don't think you're going to lose much muscle in that time at all. And that's how I would do it. But I just would have to have a good reason as to why I'm implementing it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say is that like I think we are a bit different in that, like, I think you didn't struggle very much for the most part with, putting yourself into a small surplus and just being very consistent with hitting that surplus and then just making it through a very long bulk like that. Whereas, like, I, for example, always had more issues with adherence on, well, not always, but frequently, more issues with adherence on bulks than on cuts. And then, so let's say I finished a successful diet and I was like nice and lean, like close to 10% body fat, and then I would start the gaining phase and like, okay, small surplus for a long time. I don't want to get too fat too quickly. Obviously, still want to enjoy being lean for as long as I can, even though I'm gaining. And then let's say 6 weeks have passed. It's nothing in terms of a bulk, like that's just a tiny fraction of it. But I already messed up a couple of times. Like I ate out here and there, like overdid things a little bit, or messed up at home. I don't know, just got a bit too lax with my diet, or maybe even some other things that made me overeat. And it was not great. And it's difficult to keep going and be disciplined with your diet and still being consistent with the small surplus and everything once you already feel like you kind of messed up the whole thing, and you're gonna end up fatter in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months than you intended to. And if you don't do something about that now, then it's inevitable. And when you know that, like, it's, for me at least, it was difficult psychologically to still have the same consistency and diligence. And at that point, knowing that, like, okay, so like, let's say 2 weeks from now, when I will have bulked for 8 total weeks, let's say I can throw in like a week or 2 week mini cut. That was like a big relief. Like it sort of gave me back that motivation. It's like, okay, I can still nail this if I just make this little course correction now. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's appealing for so many people, because they can get this sort of like, okay, here's this little thing that can allow me to still start with a relatively blank slate, even though I messed up.
So basically, you're saying to just do better and be consistent.
I mean, yeah, basically.
Yeah, no. I think that's totally reasonable. If somebody, if you're basically, it's certainly not the reason that people initially started talking about mini cuts, but if you did need to use it for some damage control, I think that's fine. I mean, I've certainly had periods where it's like, hey, when on a vacation or whatever it was, and I want to just do a little damage control. I don't really consider that a mini cut as much as I would just call it, just going in deficit for a few days to undo it. But I think that's fine because in that case, it's mostly probably fat gain. It happened a little too quickly. You're like, hey, let's try to reverse that. As long as somebody's not using that almost preemptively, right? Where it becomes this negative cycle where it's like, hey, well, I'm just gonna eat like crap for a month and then I'll mini cut and then I'll just eat like crap again for a month and mini cut. As long as you don't use it in that way, I think it's probably fine.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Cool. So Brandon asks, what are your thoughts on the volume hype and its relation to injury in the long term?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, volume hype has been around ever since I've been into the lifting game, and yeah, I think it has done. I think it has been the one of the root causes for a lot of wheel spinning for a lot of people. Some people for sure have benefited from it as well, although examples of that I don't know nearly as many, to be honest. Um, it's it's kind of a curious thing where, like, I see a lot of people being so supportive of the volume hype still, like even in the research community, in terms of like even when their personal opinions are asked on things, they will be really, really highly emphasizing the importance of volume. Whereas, like in some cases, I know how they program themselves and how they train their clients, and they don't program as if really volume is like, if not the only thing that matters, like by far the biggest thing that matters. And really, like not that more is better, but almost that more is better, like to like really crazy high levels or high amounts of volume. So it's kind of this weird thing, like uh, discrepancy between what people preach and then what they actually do in their own practice. And I don't quite understand why. Like, how are they benefiting from this? But it's kind of weird. And I think, like I keep going back to this, that I think that one of the main reasons why it became so popular or so easily received, this hype from actual lifters then, like that are just like consuming the information from experts, is that it's a very easily and directly manipulatable, right? um, like a metric or yeah, like component to the whole thing. So I can tell you to get stronger and to focus on progressive overload, but that's always gonna happen as fast as it's gonna happen, and you cannot rush it any more than that. So no matter how much you would like to put 100 pounds on your bench next week, you're not gonna be able to. And there are gonna be times when you're not even gonna be able to put 5 pounds on the bar. Whereas you can always do another set. And I think being able to control things that directly is like, okay, I want to increase the stimulus. I'm just going to do one more set. I think that's just very appealing because people, generally speaking, like to be in control. I know that's why it appealed to me very often and why I kept going back to it, even though I sort of knew better or I thought I knew better. But that is definitely an enticing concept. So I think that's why it's here to stay, or has been here to stay, and it will for a long time. And I also think that a lot of the study designs that we have are just simply not sophisticated enough because of, like, for logistical reasons they cannot be more sophisticated just yet, and I think they're just not able to pick up on other things that could matter just as much as volume. And I think that's another reason why volume will still be here for a long time as like a slightly overhyped concept or variable, um, because we are just not going to be able to have studies for a while that could show how, relative to other things, volume could be not unimportant, but not this like way more important than other things sort of variable.
Yeah. I just saw that Jeffrey Schofield had a video on volume and its benefits, and how most people really should be doing more and being more intense. But obviously Jeff hasn't made significant gains in a while, so the volume train hasn't worked for him. Has it, Jeff? So so Jeff is obviously does somebody who does quite a bit of volume, but I I think that the literature on it is so difficult to take seriously. Milo Wolf did that one study. He did the training from one study, and the Lyle McDonald had to pay him $1,000. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
pretty cool. Yeah.
he did an absurd amount. He was talking on Steve. Who was he talking with? No, I think he was talking with Mike Israetel about how after that he was insanely sore for like 2 weeks, and for 4 days he could barely walk. But he was actually pushing it as hard as the study claims to be pushing it. So it's like, okay, so if you have this advanced trainee who we know takes this very seriously, and he was just completely demolished afterwards, right? Do we really believe that anybody in these studies is actually training like that? I've helped run two studies, and I mean, I was basically having to coach these people along on how to do some of these things, and that's not necessarily representative of all studies, but I'm just saying, like, when we look at the data, I just don't think many of us truly believe that these people in them are pushing as hard as maybe the study authors claim in many examples, at least, right? So I think that the evidence for more volume is too strong to ignore. So I'm not saying volume doesn't matter. Um, but I can tell you that I know many people who have gotten very far on lower amounts of volume. I know many people, including myself, who have experimented with higher volumes and not really seen much of a difference. I really liked Eric Helms's commentary on this recently, I believe with Steve Hall, where he said, a lot of times people think of volume as like, going up and then it's this upside down U and or this inverted U, and how really it's more like it's going to go up. And then you're going to have this long period of time that you can adapt to it, and eventually it's going to go down. And you kind of experienced this, Abel, when you were doing something like 60 sets a week for back. Your body can adapt
Yeah.
to a lot, especially muscularly, right? I mean, maybe in terms of connective tissue and whatnot, you're going to run into problems. But I mean, I would really think that it would take a lot of volume for somebody to actually see a decrement, like to actually see a loss in muscle, if for them to just do, let's say, higher rep sets, things that were really muscularly fatiguing, but not really that harsh for your joints. I think you'd have to do so much volume because the muscles can really adapt. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually better. Now, I certainly believe somebody like Eric Helms when he says, I actually shrink on lower volume compared to, let's say, like a Jeff Alberts. I believe that anecdote for sure. And again, the research supports more volume. I've had too many clients come to me and we drop their volume and they see progress. And it's not like this situation where, like, oh, well, they were just doing so much volume. It was like they were peaking and, you just saw this initial, and people talk about this, right? That when they go to low volume, the only reason they saw progress is because they were overtrained and they saw this peak, and it was almost like they were peaking for powerlifting and then they had this increase of performance. Like, no, like these are sustained gains over time that a number of my clients have seen. I just saw somebody recently who I saw him in person, and he was somebody who I had helped out, and he was saying how he was struggling with this number of sets and what should he do. And I told him, bring it down. We'll cut it to about half, and then we'll see how things go. And we contacted me maybe 4 or 5 months later, and he's like, "Yep, like I just started progressing significantly more with this routine." And that's not me trying to promote, my services or anything. And it's not that I have every client on lower volume, because that was one of the other things that Jeff Schofield said. It was like, a lot of times these people are promoting it because it's easier, right? And so, and I understand that, right?
Mm.
Okay, the 4 hour work week and all this other stuff, it sounds easier, so it sells better. That's I understand that principle, but for me, it's just I've just had too many examples. Now, devil's advocate, if somebody is getting really good results and they're following, let's say, like RP, and they're doing increasing volume each block and it's going really well for them, they're probably not going to come to me saying, "Hey, I've been doing these routines and it's not working for me and let's get coaching," right? So obviously there's a bias
Yeah.
already in the people who come to me frustrated with lack of gains. But I've just seen it too many times where we have somebody on 6 to 8 working sets per week and they progress really well, that I can't ignore that. And I will sometimes increase volume myself. I mean, I've done significantly higher volumes, but it's not something that I say I would just do routinely. It would be like, hey, I've really tried to have every other variable dialed in and this is not progressing. Let's just see what happens if I do more. And maybe a couple instances I've seen that work. Like I've certainly seen it work for doing like an overhead press specialization. There's no way I would have gotten, from 200 to 215 to 220 plus or whatever. There's no way that would have happened if I just kept doing the exact same 3 to 6 sets per week. By the time I was maxing out on it, I was doing probably
Yeah.
15, 16 sets a week. What about you? Have you seen times in your training where you're like, okay, I'm adding volume and that specific change resulted in an increase?
Yeah, I would say once that I can clearly think back to, which was very obvious because that was a performance that like really frustrated me for a long time by then, and it was just like really not going anywhere. And actually, now that I think of it, too, so my chin ups, weighted chin ups, and bench press. So it was basically going from 3 sets of reverse pyramid. So, and I remember like first set was for like 4 to 6, second was like 6 to 8, and then I think 8 to 10, or maybe 10 to 10 to 12, 10 to 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 10 85 kilos for a set of 5 or 6. And I think one time I could do 87.5 for a set of 4. And I was just stuck on those numbers. I could just not get past them. Like as soon as I would try to increase the weight, like I would drop down to like 2, 3 reps. And it was just months and months, and like nothing was helping. And then I went from that to doing bench pressing twice a week instead of just once. And I did 5 sets on both, but it was like ascending pyramid. So, like the initial sets were not really hard.
Hmm.
So if you add up like the effective sets or whatever, it it was not like triple the work, but it was at least like 1.5 times or something. And I went up to 90 kilos for like set of 6, and then eventually 92 for a set of 6, like really, really fast. So like that was maybe the only time when I could actually see that, like, well, okay, I made this change and like I can actually see the results of that. But it's exceptionally rare that that would happen.
Yeah. And this person was also specifically asking in terms of long term from like an injury standpoint. And I think that's important to mention too, is, it does seem like you could look at it a couple of ways. You could look at it as like, a lot of times these studies on injury rates are based on 1,000 hours of doing something. Even if per time it's not going to be any more injurious, you might, if you double the volume, you're doubling the time you're training, and therefore, your total risk is going to be higher. And then, of course, the reality is it's probably not exactly the same per hour lifting because there is going to be general wear and tear. So I
Yeah.
that's why I'm not a huge fan of even like the ascending volumes and whatnot. I like the theory behind it. I just don't think that getting that meticulous of detail really matters. But I also think it's good to find a volume that you can sustain, and then maybe you could say, hey, if I'm going to really need to push something, you could push it on a certain body part and see how you do with that. It also just makes it easier to track and recover. If you're say, hey, you know what, like I do like the idea of specialization phases, even though I don't program them too often. I do think if you're at an advanced stage, you could say, hey, I'm going to do a shoulder phase, and you can more clearly see, did the increase in volume cause connective tissue or any sort of injury or overuse injuries? Because if let's say you just were to add 50% volume on everything, like full body, everything's 50% more volume, that is one, just going to be hard to recover from physically overall, two, mentally hard to recover from, but then three, I think just you might just have general aches and pains that are hard to distinguish versus saying, okay, if I'm adding more volume on this, you can really focus on, did that actually improve my situation in terms of that muscle group. Again, if
Mm.
you're somebody's looking at this long term, I really try to find ways to track what is working, so that you don't have to spend 20 years just guessing. You can actually look at it and say this. So I do like specialization phases for that purpose. And again, going back to yours that you did for back, and you could say this did or did not help me, and I did or did not have any orthopedic issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have the same feeling that like the more volume you do, and for the more muscle groups you do that, the more difficult it is to actually diagnose things. And it's, like then if things are going well, then okay, things are going well. Even then, of course, you can make the argument that it's not great that I don't exactly know what's making things go well, because like if you do a ton of stuff and if you're trying to optimize a ton of stuff in general, like you almost get to the point where, man, like now I kind of like locked myself into this mess. Like I'm doing so many things and I would like to kind of tune it back to something more reasonable, but will I be safe if I do that, or am I gonna lose everything because like I don't know what is necessary out of all of this. But like even worse is when things all of a sudden start to not go well, and then you need to change something, but you have no idea what really.
Yep.
Um, and it's yeah, so like basically like a really bare bones kind of more minimalistic ish setup. Like it can be kind of scary at first that like, wow, like is this really enough to make things happen. But at the same time, like, it's so easy to oversee. Like, if it's not working, then I mean, there are only a handful of things that you can tinker with. So yeah, like, basically the trackability and like diagnosability of things in your routine is one of the most important things, because that's ultimately what's giving you control over what's going to happen with your results, or progress, at least, if not results.
Yep. So
Yeah.
Bradley asks tips on stubborn pec muscles. I don't know who's more qualified, you because you
Hmm.
have good pecs, or me because mine are stubborn, but I haven't made them a
um,
standout body part. So
well, you start, and then I'll just from my high horse gonna chime in.
yeah. Um, so this is not an area that, and again, I hate to always touch on genetics, but it is tough because I always like to say, okay, did somebody have a weak body part and bring it up to a strong body part? And we talked before, we do see that with back quite a bit. I have not seen that with calves as much as I love Eric Helms. I do not think he qualifies as somebody who had weak calves and now has strong calves. I would say proportionally, things are pretty similar there for him, and most people. I think that one of the things I really like about Dante Trudell and Scott Stevenson, John Meadows, all of them, is that they would take a clear and distinct approach to a weak body part and focus on exercise variation. I was just talking with when I went to go see Cass and Brian and all them in Colorado, and have you done Cass's different chest exercises, like his press around that he talks about? And that was something that he was kind of guiding me on when I was there. And that's actually something I want to incorporate myself. I probably will starting next week because one of the issues I've had is anytime I do a fly variation for a long time, I end up having pec issues. It feels good the first week, second week, I'm like, oh wow, this is great. I should be doing this more. While I'm not big on the pump being a driver for muscle growth, I do think to some degree it will at least kind of tell you what is being worked. And that's something that with flies, I really get way more than any sort of benching, but I consistently run into issues with it. So with the press around, you're really not going into this deep stretch. You're kind of almost starting halfway there, and then you're kind of coming up and you're getting a really strong contraction. And so that's something that I would like to incorporate more myself. But in any case, I think that something that is often talked about is, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I think that's something that is a good point to bring up is that if you have exercises that are not working well for you, doing more of those exercises is probably still not going to work well for you. That's why some of these guys are not big volume advocates because it's like, well, the volume is important, but it's important under the context of something that is a good selection for you. And if you are somebody, and again, this is why we see it so much in back because it can distribute the load to different muscle groups. So like with calves, it's like, are there going to be some secret calf exercises that you haven't done? I mean, maybe certain calf exercises are better than others, sure. But for the most part, it's your soleus and your gastric, right? Whereas like if you're doing a row, it's like, man, there's so many things that could take over in your back so that the muscle you're trying to target is not actually being targeted. So it comes down to proper form, of course, but exercise selection. And so with pecs, kind of probably in between the two there, that other things could take over depending on how you're doing it. Obviously, if it's like a horizontal pressing, your shoulders could take over, your triceps could take over. And I would say trying to find exercises that you can progress well on over time and that will not lead to injuries. So something that is not, hey, like I was looking with flies, not, hey, this feels good for 3 or 4 weeks and then it causes a problem. Because I mean, if you can only do an exercise for 3 or 4 weeks, you might as well not even do it at all, right? I mean, if it's already going to hurt you that
Yeah.
quickly. So just trying like different variations, I think is important. And I'm not saying like this or that exercise is great because I do think there's going to be a lot of inter-individuality there, but I do think that is one of those times where I think experimenting with variations can be helpful. And I think that some people just do have weaker chests. Like I'm never going to have this like big puffed out upper chest, but I do find that certain exercises kind of get me there a little bit better than others.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say I agree with pretty much all of that. And one sort of kind of just food for thought for people is that what you think you're missing in terms of your peg development might not be what you're missing, or rather, like the people whose pec development you're aspiring to might not actually have the pec development that you think that they do, and that is, that is something that I had to realize once I had my first couple of pictures taken, where, like, really, if you look at my pecs, it looks like I have that armor plate, like symmetrical, like nice upper chest, like that line running down the middle, and that line like squeezed together by the two big pectorals. It looks like that, but the thing is that, like, I actually don't have that. It's in my case, and I think in a lot of other people's cases, it's an illusion. Like,
Hmm.
basically, depending on the angle that you're like filming yourself from, it can really seem like there is nothing in between your pecs, like they're like squeezed together because it's so muscular. And then you film yourself from another angle, and it looks like a totally bang average, slightly droopy set of pecs. Like, I actually have a video. Maybe we can like link it in the show description.
Yeah.
I think I'm talking in Hungarian on it, but yeah, like I'm actually showing how photos are made for thumbnails and whatever. And it's like I'm showing myself from two different angles. And it's like, well, if you see me from here and you show this to someone that, like, yeah, this is the guy who's talking to me about fitness on YouTube, I'm following him, like, your friends would be saying, like, what, like this guy? Like, why are you following him? And it's like, well, but this guy knows that. So check me out from this angle. And like I'm holding up the camera, and like it looks like I have the armor plate, like it looks like the pecs of Hercules or whatever. And then of course the lighting changes as well. So some people might really have that. Like, I'm sure Arnold would really have the crazy upper chest no matter what angle you would see him from in his prime. Like Omar Isuf, although I don't know, like maybe he just has really cool tank tops, but like he looks like he has some really crazy upper pecs. But I think in many cases it's just an illusion. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so the last question here is on rest pause training. So if you are going to be doing a unilateral movement, so let's just say like a one arm cable curl for a rest pause, do you recommend going back and forth, alternating? So, for example, 12 reps on the left, 12 reps on the right. By the time you finish the right side, it's now been, 45 seconds. Then go to the left, then the right, then the left, then the right. So you're kind of going back and forth. Or would you do it almost like two different exercises? So you go left arm, 12 reps, rest 30 seconds or so, let's say 7 reps, rest 30 seconds, 4 reps, and then be done. Obviously with traditional rest pause, you would do, let's say, like a chest press machine. You're going to just have your stand, you're going to be doing it with both arms. And so therefore, there's not really that question here. Here, you could kind of see arguments for both sides in terms of doing unilateral movements. So how would you break it up?
Yeah, yeah. In these cases, I always go one arm, just completing all the work for that, and then the other arm for rest pause. So otherwise, of course, or maybe not, of course, but I do like to alternate back and forth. So like left arm rest, right arm rest. But if I'm gonna be doing rest pause, then I really want to basically take advantage of the fact that it's gonna be more intense work because it's like more condensed into this briefer period. But then it's really gonna be brief, so it's gonna be like more pain, but for a brief period of time, and then I get to rest. Um, and it's sort of like the way that trade-off works for me. It's like, okay, I want to be time efficient, and in order for that to actually happen, like I'm willing to trade in some comfort that I would otherwise have because I would get to rest more. And I feel like if you're going to be alternating, then like for one, like if you do left arm and then you immediately go right arm, like it will really have to be immediately. Like you won't really be able to rest because then it's like really no longer a rest pause set anymore. Whereas like, okay, like, so I do like a 30-40 second set with the left arm and immediately go to the right arm and then back to the left. Like, yeah, I guess like if the sets themselves are not lasting too long, then it could still be classified as rest pause. But then it's going to be like a really essential thing that you're not taking any breathers between sets. And I feel like maybe even if the total time that you spend on the rest pause work that you're doing is going to be potentially less with the alternating approach, because you're never actually able to get in that bit of breather. It's going to be like just relatively seemingly so much more exhausting that I think at the end of it I just wouldn't feel like I gained anything.
Hmm.
Like it's sort of like the experience I had with pairing up like some sort of horizontal press and then like a bent over row. Like that bent over row was so taxing, and like I so needed the rest for that and nothing else. And like I really didn't want to do anything else in that rest period, but
Hmm.
just rest and catch my breath. That like it even though like yeah I cut down on time a little bit, like at the end of it I just really didn't feel like it was worth it. So that's why I would just rather cram out all the stuff I can get from one arm, then take a proper breather, and then go to the other arm. So that's me personally, but how about you?
So just real quick on the horizontal press and row example, when you had tried it, were you doing like row and then immediately the press and then resting, or how were you doing it?
Oh no, so I was trying to like um so I'm trying to think back if I actually timed my rest period, but the idea was to like roughly cut the rest period in half. So like normally if I rested like 3 minutes between sets of bent over rows, then now it would be only like a minute, minute and a half. And then I
Oh,
would do
gotcha.
the horizontal press. I mean, I guess it would be only a minute if I try to make it
Keep
like
it
as
exactly the
close
same.
to the
Yeah.
original as possible. Um, so there was some rest, but just like I was still not done with catching my breath by the time I had to go and do the horizontal press. So that was kind of the issue there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't do it like that for those exercises when because I always do alternating for presses and pulls like on like an upper power day. But I'm actually getting a ton of rest between muscle groups because I'm basically taking my full rest in between. And so like for example, I will do like an overhead press and then I'll do like a low cable row. And so between those, I might rest, you know, 3 minutes and then I'll rest another 3 minutes before going back to the overhead press. So really, I'm resting like 6 or 7 minutes between muscle groups. Um, but
Yeah.
if I were to not do it, it's still time efficient because if I were to do like just overhead press and then just overhead press again and just overhead press, I probably because I'm so used to my long rests now, I'd probably still be resting like 4 minutes in between, So it does definitely still save me some time. But I agree, I would not want to do like a heavy back exercise and then a minute later, heavy chest and vice versa. As far as the rest pause, yeah, I totally agree. This is something I mentioned to you and Brian, how basically when I was doing it for overhead tricep extension, I would just go like left arm and then right arm and then left arm, etc. And even with an easy exercise like that, it still sucked because it ended up being a 6 minute set by the time it was all done, at least five, if not
Yeah.
6 minutes. And this is not an exercise where, the one arm going is going to fatigue me so much for the other arm, like systemically or anything like that. But even then, I was just like, man, this just like, it's just annoying. It's just like, I just want to take a little bit of a break. And I would still quote unquote progress on it, but I don't think I maximized it. So then recently I tried it for a one arm pull down. And it was very apparent after just one or two sessions, like this is not going to be something that I keep doing. Basically, again, like a six
Mm,
minute pull down set where I go to the next and the next. I'm like, this just sucks. And the burn just doesn't really seem to go away. It was just very annoying.
yeah.
Even if it maybe saved a little time. So I would recommend if you're going to do it for probably any exercise, but especially a larger lift, I would say just do it on one side, focus on it, be done with it, and then give yourself a little bit of a break, and then go to the other side so you're not worried about immediately going back. Because even then, it wasn't as consistent because if you get a little bit more reps, like one week compared to the next, technically your rest has increased a little bit as well, right? Like now
Mm,
you're actually resting a little bit longer the more reps you do. So that would happen sometimes too, where it's like, well, I'd go from maybe like 30 pounds to 35 pounds. So my reps are dropping dramatically. So then my rest time has also dropped pretty significantly from one arm to the next. So it was just kind of a pain after a while.
yeah. Yeah, now that I think of it, like rest pause, like it just never worked out for me on pulls. Like pull downs, I tried multiple times, and I think the issue there is that like your forearm muscles basically get this yeah, I guess like this perma burn, perma pump that just doesn't go away. Like once it sets in, and it's just kind of like there to limit you throughout the whole like rest pause giant set or whatever.
Hmm.
So like I feel like that for me at least like needs a like a mandatory certain rest period until I feel like that's not a big limiter and is like really holding me back from really fatiguing the muscles that I actually want to fatigue, which is probably like various muscles of the back. So yeah, like never. I mean, now that I think of it, it really didn't work out on anything else except for arms and delts. For the upper body, at least, like presses, like you need too much of a setup time for them, and yeah, pulls either. So but it's more of a random comment.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Cool. Cool. So that is everything we have for today. Keep in mind if you guys have questions for future Q&As, we'll usually save them. I'll put in like an email or something like kind of like a list. So even though we just did one, if you have questions, you can send them to either our Instagrams or you can put them in the email below. If you appreciate the podcast, go ahead and share it around. We always do appreciate that. And I guess this half is going to be on Abel's channel. So you can find me, Brains and Gains Podcast, and on Instagram, Dave_Maconi. And thanks for checking in.
Thank you.